How do you take your trigger from this to this? I'm Glenn, and I'm going to explain the whole step-by-step process of adjusting the speed trigger on your Heretic Labs Article 1 in today's video. Okay, so to get started, if you buy the speed trigger by itself, it'll come just like this, with your spring and the trigger and a little bag of the set screws. Those are what we're going to be messing with. If you buy the Article 1, it's going to come with the speed trigger installed already, but the set screws will be in a little bag of optional parts. So let's go ahead and break the gun down. To get started, you'll just pop out your front and rear body pins. Separate your upper and your lower. Next, we'll go ahead and carefully pull the wiring harness up out of the grip and just tuck it somewhere out of the way. Then we're going to go ahead and pop the front pin out of its hole. And then we can take the trigger board and carefully slide it out of the lower. To remove the back pin, you'll just want to take a little tool of some type and press it out. It might be a little bit harder to get it out than the front one, but it shouldn't take much. Just go ahead and pop it out. Now, if you're doing this in your own gun, you should take some blue Loctite and apply just a little bit to each thread of the screws, just to keep them from moving once it's all installed. They will try to walk around a little bit, and when you're trying to get your trigger really tight, you'll just want to Loctite them so they don't do that. But for right now, I'm not going to worry about that. So we'll start by just screwing all of the screws in. We'll screw the front one in about halfway. The middle one should just go about flush with this surface here. You could take it a little past that. And the back one can be the same, just about flush with the top surface there. That's a great place to start. To reinstall the trigger, you'll just want to take your trigger and your trigger spring in this orientation, kind of pinch them together and tuck them down inside the lower. You'll then take your trigger pin, install it from this side, and you can just kind of reach into the trigger guard and hold on to the trigger to keep it in place, and then pop your pin the rest of the way in. Next, to get the trigger spring under the front end, you can take a flat tool like this hex key or a screwdriver with a slot in it and just pop that leg of the spring underneath your trigger. Don't worry if it takes you a few tries. I've done it a whole bunch of times, but it can take a little bit to get used to it. Next, we'll drop the trigger board back in. Feed the front pin back through the hole. And we'll go ahead and close it all back up. All we're doing here is just checking where it's at right now, and then we'll go from there. There should be basically no difference where it's at right now from where it is stock with the way I set the screws. So you can tell it all works as I'd expect a stock trigger to work essentially right now. So we'll just go ahead and pop everything back out. You don't have to do that step, but it can be helpful just to give you a baseline for where you're at. So to get started, one of the first things that you'll want to do that will give you the biggest noticeable difference easily will be to adjust the rear screw. All that's going to do is adjust the pre-travel on your trigger, and the best way to adjust that screw is to have your selector in the safe position, and we'll just go ahead and tighten down that back screw gently until it gets tight. When it gets tight, you've bottomed out on your selector switch, and your selector switch at this point will be a little stiff to move. So go until it's just tight, just snug it down, and then if it was me, I would back it off just a touch, just so nothing's rubbing when you're using your selector switch. Right there, you can tell there's almost no play when the trigger's in safe. The next thing that you can do is adjust your middle screw. That is how much engagement the trigger will have on the trigger board. So the best place to start this would be to take it just flush with the surface that it's sitting on, and then probably go just about 1/8 of a turn back from there. Now we're going to go ahead and put this back together. This whole process is definitely a little bit of trial and error, especially when you're trying to get your trigger pull really tight. So we'll just go ahead and pop this pin back in. You don't want to test any of this without the upper installed on the gun. When the upper is installed, it puts a little bit of pressure on the board and changes the spacing of everything just a little bit. So if you get it to work without the upper, it won't work when you get it back on. So definitely make sure you take the time to put everything back together before you test this. So let's go ahead and plug the battery in and see where everything's at. So we're not shooting in safe. And it's working in both of the other modes. Now I want to get even more of the trigger pull out of this. As you can tell, there's still a decent amount. The trigger pull when it's in safe is really nice and snug. That feels really good. But I want to get this trigger pull even shorter than it is right now. So once again, unplug your battery, pop out your front pins, and we'll go back through the previous steps. So now that we know we want to get the trigger pull even shorter, I'm going to adjust the middle screw. I'm going to back it out more so it sticks up above this surface, and I'm going to do that about 1/8 of a turn at a time. It's super sensitive. You might not be able to tell on camera, but it's definitely getting shorter. Safety still works. And the trigger pull is getting shorter. But I still think we can do better than that. One thing to note is the orientation of this pin. There will only be a groove in the one side here, and if you can tell, there's a spring on the side of the receiver right there that sits in this groove and retains this pin. So when you install it, you want to make sure that the pin has the groove on this side, so when it's installed, the spring will just sit right down inside of it. Okay, so now we've backed out the screw even more. And if you see here, now the safety doesn't work. So we've gone just a little bit too far. Like I said, it's a little bit of trial and error. So now I'm just going to keep going, and this time I'm going to screw that screw back in just a touch. See if we can make sure that the safety still works. Now I'm not sure if you can see this, but when I say that that screw's really sensitive, you might be able to tell that it's just barely over flush with the surface, sticking up just the tiniest bit, and it is engaging that trigger when it's in safe now. So it's very sensitive. Make sure that you don't adjust that screw too much at a time. If you do, you could run it into the trigger switch on your board and end up damaging your electronics if it's backed out too far. So definitely be careful with that. Okay, so now it doesn't fire in safe, and I have just a little bit of trigger pull when I'm in fire. I still think we can do better though. At this point, I know that if I back that screw out much more, I'm going to end up shooting when I'm in safe. And I can also tell that it doesn't actually take much of a pull before I'm engaging the trigger switch. So at this point, I'm actually going to start adjusting the front screw, which is the post-travel screw. Basically what that does is you can tighten it down and adjust how far the trigger can keep traveling after it's engaged the switch. So I'm going to start adjusting that screw just by tightening it down just a little bit, and once I feel it touch, I'm going to back it off about a half turn. One way you can kind of try to get a feel for this is by pinching down on the top of the board just gently and pulling your trigger. That will be similar to how it will be once you install your upper. So you might be able to get it a little closer by doing that before you reinstall and test everything again. So if you see now, when I'm in fire, I really have to actually push on that trigger. If I pull it normally, it doesn't quite engage. So that means that I adjusted that front screw a little too far in, and it's bottoming out the front of the trigger just before it's engaging that switch. So we'll pop out the pins again, and we just want to back that screw back out just a tiny bit. While I have this out, I'm actually going to adjust the screw that engages the switch, so the middle screw. I'm going to adjust it just the smallest amount. Safety works. Very close. Another thing with this is that it's all personal preference. So what's good for me might not be good for you. Maybe where it is right now is just great for you, and that's fine. Couldn't tell there, I actually backed it out a little too far. The nice thing about that front screw is that you can adjust it with the board still installed, and that's pretty handy. Once you get to this point where it's very close, all your adjustments are going to be very tiny, less than 1/8 of a turn of your hex key, and you'll just keep walking it in until it's right where you want it. So, there you have it. Now you can tell safety still works just like I wanted it to. And the trigger pull is super short now. I'm really happy with that. So, like I said, it's not a hard process, it's just tedious, and it will take some time. So definitely take your time with it, take it slow, and make sure that you adjust it just a little bit at a time every time. Put it back together, test it, find out what you need to adjust next, and just adjust one thing at a time for best results.